Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, I'd like to welcome you all to The Means with Dan Vrabel, your very own unscripted weekly podcast of the people, by the people, and for the people. I'm your host, Dan Vrabel. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this week to our third official weekly episode, as we've had quite the eventful week, and we have many matters to address, inquiries to resolve, and realms of knowledge to fundamentally expand our own information in. So, without further ado, let us get into it now that we've got that out of the way. Perhaps most notably this week, we have seen for the first time in church history the election of American Cardinal Robert Prevost as Pope Leo XIV, the first ever American Bishop of Rome. Now, Pope Leo XIV admittedly came in as a bit of an outsider. He was not a part of the official church's centralized administration, as most prior popes had been. He was not a widely expected candidate to assume the papacy, nor, even amongst the expected candidates, was he the most expected American to win the pontificacy. So I must admit, not just myself, but the wider betting and predictions based world was fairly surprised to see Prevost become not only Pope, but the first ever American Pope. Now, I must admit, although I do not come from a parochially inclined family, it was something that delivered me a great sense of joy and happiness to see an American elected Pope. This man, he is well renowned amongst the wider Catholic Church to be a fairly moderate outsider, a compromise on many of the key issues. He has been able to pursue and advance key compromises on issues such as migration, the environment, the issue of identity politics, and of the separation of church and state, to a degree which renders him a fairly respectable candidate and a man who, in my opinion, will end up being regarded by the annals of history as a capable and likely honorable pope. You know, as an American, this is a guy who came from Chicago. He's not unknown. There are good stories about this guy as a honest, respectable, thoughtful man, and I think that he will end up being one of the great popes when we look back on history. And I must say, I do not say this without a bit of regional sectarian pride in the fact that, as a Chicago man myself, seeing a guy who comes from the region assume the pontificacy, assume the papacy, is something that brings a lot of joy to everybody, clerics and laymen alike. And I think ultimately there are two major things to be gained from observing this. Firstly, the wider betting and prediction industry and the media as a whole tends to have little to no idea who ends up being chosen at these papal conclaves. There were a couple names in the contention who were widely expected to assume the papacy. Pietro Parolin, the official Secretary of State for the Vatican City, or Francis' own confidant, Luis Antonio Tagle, or more conservative candidates such as Peter Ergo or Robert Sara. But the fact of the matter is, this papal conclave has only vindicated the old saying a man walks into the conclave a pope and leaves a cardinal. In other words, media speculation tends to be way off in knowing who ends up assuming the papacy. It makes sense when you think about it. You have a system, a conclave election, which determines the candidates and determines the pontiff based on a secretive, undiscussed, officially non disclosed ballot, which takes endless rounds if it has to. So it would make sense without any media interference or leaks to the press why there would be little to no correlation between market speculation and who ends up becoming the Pope. So, if anything, this should show that common predictions and the common sentiment in a race that is not determined by common sentiment does not amount to much. And ultimately, in races like this, it is far harder to predict than any other simple secular election that may be open to the masses. Now, regarding his stances on the major issues and policies, I say this without any official attachment to a political agenda. I think that both the Catholic Church and the American state and people would benefit greatly from a pope who honored the supremacy of American law and the supremacy of American government administering American affairs. I say this not with a bias towards the left or to the right, but simply saying, let the business of the people be the people. However, as he has shown to do, I think he will serve to be a largely positive influence on the wider trajectory of Western civilization. However, the defining trait, so to speak, that will determine if he will be a good or a bad pontiff will, in my opinion, be will he have the ability to honor American and Western law, which I think he will. So I'd like to congratulate Prevost on winning the papacy. Moving on to other news, we have the US UK trade deal that has been passed this week, which has been proclaimed by the Trump administration to end the recent trade conflicts between our two nations, which had been started by the implementing of across the board tariffs by the Trump administration on both allies and enemies alike. Now, this trade deal ultimately did come with a fair degree of speculation and, reasonably so, celebration from both countries, as it seems that not only will tariff rates be lowered, but potentially new jobs and trade deals can be pursued in the future, as this hopefully will be the first of many trade deals. However, as most economic experts and myself, a layman, will say, this bill is ultimately, and this trade deal is ultimately unlikely to actually generate jobs. For if we look at the wider economic climate and if we look at the wider economic dynamic, this trade deal ultimately only restores a status quo antebellum. There are no new generated jobs, no new generated industries. It simply amounts to a halt on the current tariffs and trade volatility. It's a standstill, in other words. And I must say, I do support any direction and any step towards beneficial relations with our allies. I have made it clear I do not oppose tariffs and strong trade measures upon nations with a monopoly on exports, namely China. But to implement across the board tariffs on all industries and on all nations ultimately serves to isolate the American masses and the American nation state in an international market. And that does not benefit the American worker. It does not benefit the layman. It does not benefit the businessman. For if there are no markets to sell to, we stand but alone on the international market. And the fact is, to stand alone would render us without a buyer. And the fact of the matter is, since we have not seen new domestic industries prop up as they were proclaimed to be by Donald Trump, we have no ability to conduct adequate growth in domestic trade. So ultimately, to continue a trade war would be a zero-sum game, but to stop it only renders us back at square one where we started, with a fifth of our wealth fundamentally squandered. The fact is, this drama did not revive any jobs in America. We have seen continuous decline in industries and in domestic production since Trump took office, a trend that has been taking place for the last several decades. We have seen our nation lose a fifth of our national wealth in the matter of a couple of weeks. We have seen our allies feel alienated. We have seen our own government isolated. And we have seen the American people betrayed and made a fool of by an administration that cares more about petty drama than about all American jobs. This actual deal, although it does signify at least some effort of both our government in America and the government of UK's Premier Keir Starmer to work together. But ultimately, if we look at the actual fine print of this deal, it is a fairly hollow affair. It presents to us no more than status quo antebellum. It presents to us the way things were before, with American jobs leaving the country and a monopolistic benefit towards foreign exports, and foreign exports that we then import at a price that hurts the American producer. Now, I'm not saying we reinstate tariffs, by no means, But what I am saying is that this deal has no provision within it that will help generate American jobs. Nor does it even lift the tariffs. A 10% minimal tariff will still be implemented on UK goods, which fundamentally I think can be a rational step as a 10% tariff, not a 17% or 34% or some 80% tariff like the Trump administration had previously implemented, but a lower, reasonable number, which, if the deal is honored, will hopefully stay and stabilize the wider American marketplace. Now, a 10% tariff is good as an across the board standard, but the only problem is we have seen the United States government under Donald J. Trump implement across the board tariffs, sometimes upwards of 40 and 50%, on nations that are objectively our allies. We have seen the United States implement across the board substantial tariffs on nations such as Canada, Mexico, the United Kingdom, France, all of the European Union, and, believe it or not, even Israel. We have seen tariffs mounted of substantial size and of no benefit to the American worker passed on our allies. Now, rational tariff policy, as we have asserted, would not be free trade. It would not be a complete abandonment of the American worker under cheap foreign goods. But nor would it be some absolute isolationist trade policy, which isolates our own nation and serves only to benefit the alternative producers, such as China, who now no longer have to deal with the large American state in the foreign market. The fact is, if we want to win the war for the 21st century, and if we want to ensure that the American worker can live in prosperity and cannot be swamped out by cheap, predominantly Chinese goods, the fact of the matter is, the way to do this is to rally our allies, to have a block of trade between ourselves and our Western Republican allies, to ensure that although trade can still subsist with fairly minimal intervention, we can pass tariffs on the nations with monopolies on exports. This, ladies and gentlemen, would be a square deal, but that is not what we have had. We have had an eradication of our national wealth, we have had an eradication of our national credibility on the world stage, and we have had immense volatility between ourselves and our allies, only to be resolved by an insufficient and largely symbolic trade deal that only serves to restore things to square one, which is the American worker, producer, businessman, and consumer losing out on the day-to-day. The fact of the matter is, Americans are still hurting, and this administration has served to do nothing but botch the economic issue by isolating ourselves from allies and cutting our safety nets. The fact of the matter is, it's a tragedy. It's an interference on the natural market and the natural ebbs and flows that have kept this nation running for centuries. And frankly, it fills me with a great deal of shame to see it continue. In other news, we have seen American judges continue to block Trump's overhaul of government funds and mass unapproved firings of the federal workforce from departments that are constitutionally required to be affirmed or denied by the United States Congress. We have seen these mass firings take place largely under the helm of DOGE, the foreign-backed, big money-backed scheme run by both Trump and his self-proclaimed puppet master, Elon Musk, who has served over the last couple months to not only dismantle the American government, not only dismantle our credibility, not only see to it that hundreds of millions of Medicaid dollars have now gone missing without a trace like a ghoul in the night, presumably taken by external forces of evil, with no record nor accountability, but we have seen the firing of tens of thousands of government workers without probable cause, without probable qualifications, without substantial benefits, and most importantly, without constitutional approval to do so. Now, the fact of the matter is, I think both myself and any rational American would support the wider trajectory and the noble mission of ensuring an efficient and well-functioning government. Nobody, big government or small government supporter, would want to see a government that cannot do its job the best it can do. And I am all for trimming down waste. But the fact of the matter is, this has not served to trim down waste. This has served to render hundreds of millions of dollars gone missing without a trace. This has served to see tens of thousands of mostly good American workers lose their job without any cause or qualification. This deal and this program has served only to massively and egregiously cripple the ability of the American government to help everyday Americans. It has served to cripple and to disable the American government from its fundamental duty to look after Western civilization. For just as it is a civilization's duty to look after her government in a spirit of civic virtue, it is a government's duty as a strong and noble state to look after her civilization and to ensure the prosperity of the masses. But that has not been what we have seen. We have seen this absolute ransacking of government treasuries and reserves, and we have seen the unconstitutional removal of tens of thousands of American workers, which has fundamentally served to not only increase the unemployment rate, but it has served to decrease the efficiency and ability of the American government to get things done. For the fact of the matter is, although the American government, in theory, may benefit from cutting certain excess sections and excess functions, the fact of the matter is, if we cut everybody from the workforce, all we have is a husk of a government agency that is not able to do its job to help the American people and is not able to do its job to help American prosperity. And furthermore, the continued trend of Trump refusing to follow judge precedent and the decrees of the American judiciary has served to rise the tides of a potential constitutional crisis. For if we have a president who does not follow the orders of the court, the orders of the law, and the orders of the Constitution, we do not have a president in his rightful name. Fact of the matter is, frankly, we reside in a nation that has managed to become not only the most successful democracy, the most successful republic in the history of the world, but the most powerful and successful nation in the history of man. And the fact of the matter is, this has been able to be achieved not through any outside or external force, but through both the joint resilience and capability of the American people and the profound success that has been delivered to us by the constitutional American system. The American school of government and everyday life has been what has allowed for great prosperity to seep through every household, every family, and every street in America. This prosperity is what allowed America to become the world's foremost republic, but it was done solely through the honoring and the establishment of sound constitutional provisions, the honoring of a constitution as the law of the land, the honoring of constitutional virtues like civic duty, separation of powers, balance of powers, checks and balances, the rule of law, the popular mandate, and a sense of noble obligation. All of these virtues have been what allowed America to thrive and survive through the centuries. And to refuse to honor these noble principles would only be to degrade the nobility and the virtue of our republic. For if we do not have a president that respects the rule of law, that respects the order of judges that he appointed, as a matter of fact, we have a government that refuses to honor the law of the land. For it has been the creed of the American state and of the noble American people that we bow and pledge loyalty not to a man, not to a sovereign king or tyrant, but to the flag and the republic for which it stands. We pledge allegiance to a flag that stands not just for our republic, but for a sacred principles, sacred virtues such as tradition, honor, duty, liberty, and most importantly, the rule of the Constitution. And to upend that purely out of a man's own egotistical desire to upend and recreate the American government in his image, whether a good cause or not, and frankly, I think at the moment it is not in any way a good cause, only serves to degrade and erode the values and stability that has provided American progress and prosperity. Now, the fact of the matter is, this constitutional tradition is one that ought to be defended with utmost resilience and strength, from the most liberal Democrat to the most conservative Republican, uniting under a profound sense of duty and conviction to follow the word of the Constitution. For if we do not have a political spectrum and a political dynamic that pledges its own undying loyalty to the virtues of a republic, we merely have a bunch of opportunists, a bunch of men who will be willing to say whatever it is necessary to get into power without having a true sense of honor and commitment to our Constitution and our laws. Because the fact of the matter is, without the strong rule of law and without law and order in our land, we lack the ability to rule and to live honorable lives. And frankly, this attempt to upend the rule of law makes me sick. But what we need when we have the attempt of those who claim illegitimate power to upend the constitutional balances that have kept this republic going for centuries, what we need are not ineffective voices in the opposition. We need a loyal yet steadfast opposition that is willing to not only proclaim undying loyalty to the republic, but is willing to proclaim an undying sense of duty to uphold both Constitution, the Union, and the laws. Yet that is not what we have seen. Unfortunately, as Trump's own agenda may be delegitimizing the Constitution and serving to upend our noble Republican traditions, the Democratic Party has served to largely be ineffective in not only combating these attempts and these actions, but they have served to be ineffective in rallying popular discontent. The fact of the matter is, the Democratic Party, following their cataclysmic loss in 2024, in what was nearly a landslide defeat that was expected by little to none within the party establishment, the Democrats have not been able to mount either a strong leadership or a sense of being able to do anything to speak to the American people since November. For the fact of the matter is, although they may have a noble goal, the Democratic Party has ran and continued to press on issues that are fundamentally out of touch with the everyday American. The fact of the matter is, the everyday American is hurting from an economy that is going downhill at a rapid, unprecedented rate. The average everyday American is hurting from a government that serves to represent a small cabal of foreign elites rather than the honest, red-blooded American people. The American people are suffering from a government that has cut out and upended its own institutions that have provided stability for decades and, hell, even centuries. And the fact of the matter is, the inability of the Democratic Party to combat and to effectively present an alternative to this course of action has been why the American people have been unable to effectively counter this measure. The fact of the matter is, if we have a party that has not been able to speak to the interests of the people and has remained out of touch with the people, continuing to run on obscure culture war issues that, whether or not they have legitimacy, are deeply unpopular with the American people. The fact of the matter is, this state of affairs cannot go on. And what the American people require is a steadfast, dedicated opposition that will not only proclaim opposition to any actions that serve to upend the Constitution, but serve to pledge loyalty to the Republic, serve to combat corruption with the strength and resolve of the popular will. An opposition that serves to honor the economic prosperity of the American masses, both of the businessman, the laborer, and the consumer alike. We need an opposition that serves to honor the common prosperity and the common interest of the American people, and one that can take back the common destiny and duty of this nation as a noble republic, set forth upon noble virtues and a duty to help our fellow man. The fact of the matter is, that has not been what we have seen in the recent months and weeks. And frankly, it's a tragedy. In other news, we have seen the continuing trial against Mark Zuckerberg held by the FTC on accordance of claims that Zuckerberg and his corporation Meta have violated American antitrust laws, which serve to prevent the formation of un-American and frankly unfree monopolies. Now, these laws, although they have been combated by a great many in both the Republican Party and the larger small government movement, have served to fundamentally uphold and honor the free market. For antitrust laws do not serve a vague purpose. They serve a very definitive purpose of ensuring that we have a free and competitive market. For if we have monopolies that are unregulated by the federal government, the fact is you have one seller, one buyer, one man who controls the price and value of the goods that keep America's market moving. And this backroom way of functioning, this way of functioning with one man, a tyrant unto himself, and a law unto the masses, serves to act without legitimacy and without the interests of a free American marketplace. For the fact is, a monopoly is not American, it is not capitalist, and it is fundamentally an attack on the freedom that defines a true, honest marketplace. And the fact of the matter is, it is the duty of a strong government and of a morally resolute government to combat these monopolies and this cabal of elites to ensure that we have a free and fair market that generates competition, that generates the competitive American spirit that has been the forerunner to the American dream. However, as both a majority of pundits and legal experts have decreed, it seems that it is unlikely for the Federal Trade Commission and the American government to win this case, given the recent precedent of FTC antitrust cases such as FTC v. Microsoft and FTC v. Apple, which have unfortunately served to back the preservation of these massive un-American monopolies and their impediment on the market. For the fact of the matter is, the modern American market, in its now increasingly digital source and form of transactions, has largely served to be dominated by 5 major monopolies. We have seen Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Zuckerberg's own Meta serve as the 5 titans of modern industry, the 5 titans of tech that have served to be the sole monopolies and the sole dictators of the market. Fact of the matter is, this state of affairs cannot go on, for it impedes a free market and it impedes competition. For all of these massive monopolies themselves were only able to form in the first place, as they should have, within a free and fair market, one with competition. That is what allowed these markets to grow. The fact of the matter is, the markets cannot grow if we lack competition. There is no incentive, there is no drive, and there is no fundamental duty to keep the market going and to keep up innovation if we have only a select few that, like the oligarchs in Russia or the politburos of communist China, control the market and prevent free exercise of enterprise. The fact of the matter is, this state of affairs harms the free market, and it fundamentally goes against the American people's spirit of business. For America's business is business. But the fact of the matter is, this cannot go on in a realm dominated by monopolies. So, I can only express my naive sense of hope that the FTC shall win this trial and that monopolies shall be combated so as to honor the time-tested American tradition and practice of trust busting and to preserve the free market from attacks on free capital. Now, in addition, we have seen China and the United States begin trade talks in Geneva following weeks of a tumultuous trade war that has ultimately served to discredit the American nation-state and the American people on the world stage. As we have seen China not only mount their retaliating tariffs upon us, but we have seen a great amount of credibility allotted to China on the world stage in prior months. We have seen the People's Republic of China, which is not for the people, is not a republic, and as I have said, can barely even be called a legitimate Chinese state. We have seen them largely usurp our role as the world's preeminent superpower, as the United States under Donald J. Trump has further conceded its position as the leader of the free world, and we have seen the American government concede its duty to the world's republics. But most importantly, we have seen the American government concede a fifth of its wealth through misguided economic policy. And now, as China and the US come to trade talks, they are likely to be ineffective. And even if we do receive some sort of trade deal, the fact of the matter is, Trump's own weakness has served to delegitimize the American government and market on the world stage. We have lost our fundamental credibility, as the American government has went from one economic policy one day, another the next, and back to the same old policy on the third day. The fact of the matter is, this inconsistency and this lack of credibility has been what has largely served to isolate our nation in recent months, and has served only to continue to lose jobs and to detriment our very own industry. Fact of the matter is, at this time, perhaps the worst possible thing we could do is lower our pressure on China. Fact of the matter is, what we need to do is to have a stern backing of our allies and stern pressure on the Chinese monopoly on exports, so as to ensure that instead of importing cheap Chinese goods that harm the American worker, we can produce all American goods made by the American worker, benefiting the American consumer, and providing jobs and honest days' work to the American laborer. But this has not been done. All that has happened in the last several months has been an ineffective trade war that will most likely result in a deal or no deal, China continuing to have their monopoly on exports. This deal will not harm Chinese industry. The fact of the matter is, it's near impossible to do so at this point with the current measures that have been used by the Trump administration. And if we were to try to dismantle a foreign monopoly such as the Chinese state, the only way to properly do this would be to keep the pressure on the Chinese with the backing of the Western Republican order, not through an inconsistent and incoherent trade policy, as we have seen in recent months. And frankly, this lack of credibility brings me a great deal of sorrow, for I fear if we continue on this route, the American government and the American state will lose its credibility on the world stage. And if we lose our credibility, we are at risk of abdicating our position on the world stage as a leader of the free world. In further news, we have seen rising costs and economic downturn under the Trump economy, which has fundamentally served, although with good intentions, has served to detriment both the American laborer, businessman, and consumer alike. And frankly, it's a tragedy. This botched economy and this continued economic downturn has served to harm the American people, with the American government not implementing the fundamental reforms and the fundamental strong economic action necessary and to stir the process of growth. In other news, we have seen the continued raids by the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, throughout the country, namely in Newark this week, as we saw the mayor of Newark, a multi-generational American citizen, be detained by ICE following what was claimed to be the incitement of disorder. Now, I would like to state this fact. Do not be mistaken, I do not oppose the fundamental actions of cracking down on violations of law and order. I fundamentally support any and all efforts by the government to ensure law and order is followed. However, there is no law and order if we do not respect our own rule of law. For there is no more illegitimate source of power than a government that passes a law and does not even follow its own decree. The fact of the matter is, I support the efforts of, and I think most rational Americans would support the efforts of ICE to crack down on crime, to crack down on unruly behavior, and to crack down on illegal immigration, provided we follow the rule of law. For if we do not follow the rule of law, we are no better than the tyrants, the despots, and the crooks that we seek to stomp out in a noble venture. And without respect for the rule of law, our legitimacy comes merely from force, which it must not come solely from. Rather, we must derive our legitimacy from the humble abode of virtue. In other news, we have seen Democratic Governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, express his interest in recent weeks of potentially running for the presidency in 2028. Now, Beshear himself has been noted not only as a blue governor in one of the reddest states in the country, but as a reliable, common sense moderate who has proven himself immensely popular with those both on the left, center, and right. And frankly, I say this with utmost sincerity, that provided there is not some other outsider or a return of Democrats like Sherrod Brown or Tim Ryan, Andy Beshear may very well be the best possible nominee for the Democrats in 2028. He's likable, charismatic, fairly young. He has a proven track record and proven results. And perhaps most importantly, his moderation and his ability to appeal to those on the center and right enables him to win a broad coalition and a resolute mandate for the presidency should he be the nominee. Frankly, I think a candidacy and a ticket such as Andy Beshear as president and let's say Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy, or if he were to return, Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, or even the former Pennsylvania Senator Bob Casey Jr. as a VP would be a great ticket. Or, for instance, a ticket with Andy Beshear as president and Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff as vice president. I think any one of these tickets will serve not only as an incredibly charismatic ticket, but a successful moderate ticket. For moderation, distancing ourselves from identity politics, and an embracement of the course of reform is the only tangible way for the Democratic Party to win in 2028 and to take back the destiny of the American people. And moderation is the only way to do so. So I will say, although he has not officially ran, if he were to do so, I would have a very hard time not endorsing Andy Beshear for the Democratic nomination. Who I'd endorse for president, it is far too early to say, and far too early to contemplate, whether it would be a man of one end of the aisle or the other. But if Beshear were the nominee, he'd make a pretty convincing case of why I should support him. In foreign news, we have seen the left win not only in Canada last week, but we have seen a resolute landslide victory of the left-wing Labour Party in Australia, which, up until a couple weeks ago, had been expected to be an almost certain victory for the right-wing National Coalition in Australia. But following backlash of Trump's foreign presence and the unpopularity of Donald Trump's tariff policy, we have seen, as we did in Canada, a last-minute surge in the popularity of the left. And the fact of the matter is, this condition of a rather ironic defeat for Trump's own fellow conservatives has been commonplace around the world in recent weeks. This Trump effect, in which Trump's own policy has served to alienate otherwise reliable allies, and thus allow for those on the opposite end of the political aisle as him to win elections by increasingly dominating margins. We saw one of the largest landslides of the last 25 years in Australia. We saw one of the best performances, actually the best performance of the Liberal Party in Canada in popular vote of nearly 60 years. So it comes without any sense of surprise and amazement that Donald Trump has served to detriment his own fellow conservatives. Furthermore, we have seen within both the United Kingdom and Romania, however, a stunning yet decisive victory for the far right in both the UK's local elections and the elections for the Romanian presidency following the cancellation of their elections last year. Now, this rise of the far right has been one that has been fairly alarming, for less any other reason, but more due to the fact that all of these movements have been widely and immensely friendly with the regime of Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. For I think the people and the republics of the West can withstand many trials and tribulations. But the fact of the matter is, A regime that is willing to buddy up to and cozy up to dictators is not one of them, and must be met with steadfast opposition and the steadfast collaboration of left, center, and right across the Western world and a reaffirmed Republican order. Lastly, in an official new session and new section of our podcast, Bill Watch, in which we observe the latest proposed legislation in Congress of the last week and what, if anything, the United States Congress has been able to achieve, we have seen two major pieces of legislation emerge within the United States Congress in the last week, albeit none of them were passed. Firstly, we have seen the Megabarry Act proposed by hawkish Republican Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, which was proposed to counter the influence of both Russia, China, and Iran, the three bulwarks of tyranny in foreign nations, namely in the Republic of Georgia. And frankly, I would like to commend Representative Wilson in what is a noble venture and perhaps the noblest venture of legislation we have seen in this Congress, with the sole exception of Hawley's Pelosi Act. I think that this act serves not only to benefit the American people, but republics around the world, as if it were to be passed, it would counteract the increased isolationism and the increased collaboration with tyrants that we have seen under the Trump administration. For this act, that will serve in direct opposition to the bulwarks of tyranny, communism headed by China, ultranationalism or militarism headed by Russia, and Islamism and Islamic fundamentalism headed by Iran, all of which serve in direct contradiction and direct opposition to the noble virtues of republicanism, which is, was, and frankly still ought to be headed by the United States of America. So I say with utmost sincerity that this bill will not only counteract the isolationism of the Trump administration, but would reaffirm the American duty as the world's foremost republic to defend the world from tyranny and ensure the universal victory of republicanism and democracy over dictatorship. So I fully support Republican Representative Wilson as a man who has proposed a noble bill, and I hope that this bill gets passed and call upon Congress to do so. In other news, we have seen a rather celebratory occasion in which the proposed Crypto Act, backed by big tech, monopolies, foreign investors, and much of the pro-crypto Republican Party, has failed in Congress, thanks to a loose coalition of both the Democratic Party and anti-corruption Republicans, namely the collaboration of Josh Hawley, who has been noted for his recent streak against corruption and against special interests, for which I must commend him. For the fact of the matter is, this bill would have, if passed, not only legitimized un-American and untested cryptocurrencies, not only would have provided an otherwise illegitimate path for legitimization and transaction of these currencies, that many of which are linked to scam coins, but it was too soft on crypto, and it ultimately did not deliver the strong legislation, regulation, and acts against corruption that are needed to crack down on scam coins and deliver consumer protections for the American investor. But the fact of the matter is, this bill would not have covered protections against fraud in scam coins, as we saw with the recent scam coin of Trump coin. This bill would not have provided protections against corruption and government entanglement. This bill would not have provided a centralized ability to regulate cryptocurrencies that propose a dangerous alternative to sound, honest, tangible goods, namely goods tied to the American dollar. This bill would only have served to delegitimize and destabilize the American dollar and solid, real American goods, as opposed to the unreliable, unregulated, and frankly dangerous industry that is unregulated cryptocurrency, which is and ought to be considered as a severe threat to economic stability and economic level-headedness, which is namely defended by preserving the American dollar. Frankly, markets, or cryptocurrency in this case, without regulation, are much like sheep without a shepherd. It is only a matter of time before they are preyed upon by forces of a greater evil. And thus it is our duty, as noble arbiters of a free and fair market, to ensure that these forces of evil never prevail in the American marketplace, and that they never prevail over the common interest, common needs, and the common destiny of the American people. And for that reason, I call upon Congress to pass far stricter legislation on cryptocurrency and regulation that serves to only enhance a free market and crack down on crime and what fundamentally has been online grifters and scammers that serve to make a mockery of the free American market. Lastly, we have seen an increased escalation within the conflict between India and Pakistan, as the two nations have exchanged numerous bombings and drone strikes upon each other's border regions before a temporary ceasefire that had been mediated by the United States, only to last for a couple of hours before being broken by continued bombing. We have seen this escalation of conflict mark potentially the largest conflict and the largest surge in conflict since the war in Ukraine. And I can assure you, everyone, and I mean everyone, both the noble forces of republicanism and the forces of tyranny in China, are watching with a great sense of angst to see how this dilemma plays out, as the Chinese state have expressed their backing for the Pakistani government, while I and a majority of the West must express backing for the Indian state, which at the moment serves only to defend itself and retaliate against terrorist attacks by Islamic extremists upon unarmed civilians. And I support any and all efforts of the Indian government and of aligned Western governments to crack down upon terrorism and to ensure the victory of freedom and a dignified life. Having said that, I think both myself and any rational American hopes for the best in this situation and hopes for a stern, long-lasting peace and the victory of republicanism over tyranny. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this week. We have had quite the eventful one, and we will be back next week to address the matters of inquiry that have yet to reveal themselves. Thank you all for listening, and have a wonderful evening.